Hello everyone, I'm Brad. I'm one of the founding team at SenseOn. I'm going to take you through today threat mitigation and your SOC. I'm going to speak very, very little about our platform. I'm going to talk more about the problems and how you can apply these to your SOCs. So if you don't know me, I'm one of the founding team at SenseOn, as mentioned. I'm the director of technology here. Previously in the past, I ran the threat hunt team at BT. I was a SOC manager at EE. I did some offshore security stuff as well for GE Oil and Gas. And there is a picture of me fishing, doing an incident response job in the Mediterranean, which is one of the coolest incident response pictures I've got. A bunch of standard qualifications, nothing too exciting, kind of CIS, CISM, TOGAF, etc. And feel free to email me or contact me on LinkedIn and connect with me after this. I'm more than happy to answer any of your questions. Today we're going to go through threat mitigation. What is it? How do you measure it? And also, like, as a incident response community, we often talk about having metrics. I've certainly had CISOs come to me in the past being like, can you give me some metrics from your SOC? I've always struggled to figure out what were useful metrics and why, and how could I benchmark them. And we often create stats for the sake of creating stats rather than kind of determining what good value is and what should good targets be. And the key thing out of detection and response is kind of how we measure it, how we measure how effective we are at our investigations, how good we are at measuring how quickly we can respond to things and contain things. And today we're going to go through that. And there's very, very little, there is a consensus across the industry. There's lots of papers, posts, and articles saying we should respond quickly, we should contain things fast, but there's very, very little statistics out there in terms of what does good look like and how fast do attackers actually operate within the environment. We've always heard these stories about WannaCry operating in seconds and advanced actors with humans on the other end pivoting across the estates, but there's very, very little analysis. The only analysis we saw actually came from another vendor, and that vendor was CrowdStrike, and they said on SOC teams should have an average of 1 minute to detect an attack, 10 minutes to understand that, and 1 hour to contain that. So I'm going to take some real world stories from SenseOn's customers and SenseOn's experiences from real world incidents that will hopefully be able to apply to your SOC and have a good level of target of what you should be aiming for. So first ones, we're going to be going through some very basic metrics, by the way. We're not looking at really advanced metrics. We want to kind of get you started on something that you could use within your team, whatever tool set you're using, whether you're using SenseOn, whether you're using any product, whether you're just using a traditional SIEM or antivirus, just how thoroughly can you investigate and what are kind of good basic metrics you should do. So those basic metrics we're going to go through. We're then also going to, in a minute, we're going to look at applying them to real world SOCs. We've got some statistics of non-SenseOn customers. We're also going to then be looking at applying those stats to real world attacks and giving you some detailed analysis of what those real world attacks look like. So the first thing that we measure is something called the mean time to acknowledge. And we use this as a measure of our SOC's performance internally. So SenseOn, we have a 24/7 follow the sun global SOC. And we use this to kind of measure effectively how quickly from when an event is created before a human analyst jumps on it. So you have to ignore any SOAR interactions, anything that's automatic, and you have to be judging this based upon when a ticket comes in for a human being to work on, how quickly can that human being actually start working on that. If you are polluting your stats with SOARs, or maybe I know one MSSP in this country who they publish their mean time to acknowledge and they say it's seconds, but really their acknowledgement is an email autoresponder. That is absolute baloney. You should not be using statistics based upon things that are machine generated. They should be done entirely upon your team actually responding to it. So why this is important is because before your SOC starts working on something, you can't mitigate it. Often there needs to be human beings to analyze it and do that basic level of triage. So we track and we report this, and it's very, very useful to kind of measure capacity, measure teams' performance, and measure kind of how interested they are and how focused they are at their job. And often you'll find some of your best analysts who do the best investigations might not be responding as quickly as you would like because they're working on more interesting things and they're trying to they don't necessarily want to do the most important thing they can do for you and your companies and potentially your customers, is because they're working on more interesting things. They don't want to do the basic triage. So we use it to help measure capacity. We also use it to help detect potentially burnout within our staff, because good analysts sometimes won't respond quickly, and that's a good leading indicator that we might need to jump in and work on something. The next time we look is we measure how effective we are in terms of how long it takes us to do the investigation. And the reason why this is important is because there's two bounds for this. If we're doing really fast investigations, normally that might indicate that someone's not doing a thorough investigation. So if I've got an analyst who is averaging several minutes for an investigation, I can be damn sure they're not thinking, what's the so what? What's the root cause? What's the pivots that we could do on that customer? How could we determine what's really going on the hood here? So if your time to investigate is too quick, normally that would be an indication that that would be quite a worrying indicator for me that the quality is not sufficient. Also, if the time's too long, normally that would indicate that they don't understand the tooling, they don't understand the right pivots to do. So if on average they're taking more than 30 minutes on an average of all of their cases, some cases will obviously take more than 30 minutes, but if you're taking that as an average across all their workload, that would also be an indicator that they might not have the right skill set, they might not have the right visibility in the tools, and they might be struggling to do it and connect all those individual dots to determine how long they should be in investigating something. So we'll go through our stats in a moment. Then finally, we look at adding up the mean time to acknowledge and the mean time to investigate, and we calculate the mean time to resolve. And that's how long it takes for our analysts to come to a conclusion and resolve a case and alert. And we actually had a lot of feedback from customers that they wanted to see these stats in our product. I'll go through some of those stats in a minute and what they look like when we expose this to all of our customers. So we provide details for every single case in terms of the time to acknowledge, the time to investigate, and the time to resolve in that. And this is important. This is the key metric, is because if this includes containment actions and this includes a full write-up from the SOC to prove that they've done that analysis, but this is the key metric which allows you to benchmark at real-world attackers and help determine, is this real? Am I going to be able to stop a real-world attacker and do the job of detection and response? If you can't move as quickly as an attacker, it's very, very worrying, because that's the whole purpose of your team. That's the whole purpose why you're buying these tools. Otherwise, you may as well just do everything in preventative controls if you haven't got effective detection and responsive controls. I've certainly worked in SOCs in the past where we've had challenges with the mean time to resolve, because we would sometimes work 9 to 5. And a case might come in on a Friday afternoon and you might not deal with that until Monday, or potentially it might come through in the afternoon and you might not investigate fully that the next day. That is a huge time to resolve, and if depending upon the severity and the threat, that could lead to an attacker being able to do what actions they want on their own objectives, which is you and your important systems. And we'll go through that in a minute. So yeah, absolutely critical measurement, and that's the whole purpose of the SOC, is measuring the mean time to resolve. So just to recap, 3 simple metrics, very, very simple. Mean time to acknowledge, that is the time for when your analysts start working on something. The mean time to investigate, that is how long it takes your analysts from when they've started something to they're able to complete their investigation. And the mean time to resolve is generally in SenseOn, we have it as the mean time to acknowledge and the mean time together. And those metrics must be done by human beings, not polluting them with your automated metrics of things like SOARs or other platforms or autoresponders. And as we go through, if you want to ask any questions, please put them in the chat. Please send us a message. You can use the Q&A or the chat function to send me any comments or questions as we go through. So we're looking at comparing 3 external companies that have no relationship to SenseOn. The only relationship that they have to SenseOn is they are friends with our SOC manager, and our SOC manager is able to prize some information out of them. The 3 companies are a finance company, which has a managed SOC, and that's they're using an external company for that, and they've got about 30,000 endpoints. The second company is a manufacturing company, again, a managed SOC around about 8,000 endpoints or so. Company C is a healthcare company. They have an internal SOC, and they've got around about 2,000 endpoints, and then we're comparing it to SenseOn statistics as well. And these are SenseOn statistics from around about 4 or 5 months ago. As I'll go through in a minute, since we've been publishing and then recording these and showing these into our customers, it's been a massive driver for us to kind of make sure that we're getting even better, because we're exposing these stats to customers, and that's a massive psychological drive for even for our own analysts to know our customers can see how effective they are. So that's really helped us improve the stats even further. So looking at the kind of real world of those 3 external companies, which have, I stress, have not used SenseOn, company A, B, and C, they're using their own internal or external SOCs, their own external third-party tooling. We asked to get some of their details in terms of how quickly they were with the mean time to acknowledge and the mean time to investigate and the mean time to resolve. And there was quite a few interesting findings. The first one is, if you look at the yellow line, which is the mean time to resolve, it's pretty consistent against all the companies. However, there's a huge variance. It's almost like night and day in terms of the mean time to acknowledge and the mean time to investigate. We didn't understand this data. We were very curious about what was driving, why there's this huge variance in the mean time to acknowledge and the mean time to investigate. Because we know internally that the mean time to acknowledge is a good indicator of SOC capacity in terms of workload, and the mean time to investigate is a good measurement of SOC quality in terms of how good and how effective they are and are they doing the right investigations. So when we started looking at that, we thought a key driver was adherence to SLAs. So most of these internally and externally, they would have a key driver to resolve a case or a ticket that was created within an hour. We also think there's massive capacity and skill issues there. So, for example, if you take Company B is they're answering relatively quickly. So they're answering at the time in about 7 minutes. But then they would spend 40 minutes on an investigation. That, for me, if you're spending 40 minutes on average on an investigation, there are absolutely plenty of investigations which take longer than 40 minutes. If you're taking an average on 40 minutes, you've either got terrible tools, you're working on multiple things at the same time, which is kind of a terrible thing to do. SenseOn, we generally try and have our analysts to work on one case at a time. So they do not get distracted. They finish off that case to make sure that case is completed. You can't have analysts working on multiple cases at the same time. That's a recipe for just messaging the wrong customer the wrong kind of things. They only work on one case at a time. But for me, it's very worrying to see a SOC with an average time to an investigate of 40 minutes. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got one which is about 8 minutes, which could be good. This team, I don't necessarily know which tooling they've got internally, but that could be a good indicator. But it was taking them 43 minutes to start the investigation, and that gave them an average response time of a mean time to resolve of about 52 minutes. So I think in this one, actually, the time to investigate and the time to resolve is driven very, very heavily by adhering to an SLA. And it's really, when you start to analyze these, and there isn't necessarily if you have it too low, it could be, if the mean time to acknowledge is too low, that could be that you're potentially over-resourced or you're not investigating the right cases. And if it's too high, also you've got capacity issues or potential motivation issues within your SOC. So we're going to go through 2 real-world stories of SenseOn customers who, with permission, we've shared these stories. We've just changed a few details in things like IP addresses, host names, domain names. The sectors might be similar, but not exactly the same. But we wanted to give you some real-world stories of customers who've had major incidents across SenseOn's environment and some of the challenges that we have with the investigation, what our investigations look like, and also in these scenarios when the attacker was able to progress across the environment, how quickly they were able to do that and what that looked like. First one is a organization which for the purposes of this, we're going to say they've got a revenue of over 100 million. It's a construction company, and because of the nature and the fragmented umbrella style organization, we were in one part of the business on 500 endpoints, but we weren't on every single part of the business. We see this in kind of a lot of complex, large organizations. Some arm of the business might do something different from the rest to experiment. And this is a really good story for us because we're able to compare our analysis to the wider tooling that they had. And this customer had SenseOn. They had only one full-time equivalent for security within that environment. This attack started off as something called Gootkit or Bootloader. If you're not aware of it, this is an attack called SEO poisoning. We see this actually as increasingly, it's one of the most common ways that attackers get into organizations these days. We've got a blog post on the bottom that you can go through and have a review in terms of we analyzed it. We did some, we showed some real world attacks. I'd probably say across our customers, it's probably more common as a method of initial access now than things like malicious Office macros in documents, things like that. This is very, very common. This is what it looks like. So, for example, normally someone will search for a niche term. They'll search for a niche term, like, for example, Section 33 agreement of the Local Government Act 1982. Normally, this will be someone in your finance team, maybe your accounting team. And then when you visit that page, it will give you a JavaScript, it will give you a zip file. And within that zip file is normally a JavaScript file. Now, we train all of our users, don't run executables. But if you ask someone in finance, is a JavaScript file or a .js file an executable? They probably wouldn't think it was because we train them to think like, normally executables are things like .exes, things like that, or .msi files. They're not used to seeing other types of executables like .msi. And in this case, when the user runs it, we see it executing on that individual environment. So this was initially started from a user in one of the other business units, and then they downloaded one of these files. On that file, on that system at the time, it was Microsoft Defender for Endpoint was running on it. MDE didn't pick it up as a particular infection at that point, and then we saw some scanning that occurred from that endpoint on there. That scanning came from that system. We created a medium scoring observation because we weren't running on the endpoint, but we saw scanning coming from it. And scanning, if you're not aware, is very, very common in most organizations. So you see scanning all the time. Things like you'll see scanning for SMB every time someone opens someone's like tries to add a printer, things like that. The attacker then took the key files and on that system they compromised. They effectively took some of the stored hashed credentials on that system, and then they did an offline attack, and that offline attack is called curb roasting, and effectively take the curb roast credentials and they try and crack the details. In this case, the customer had they were using the administrator account for the domain admin, and there was a very, very kind of weak credentials that were running on that system. And then later on, the attacker came back the next day onto that system. They then had started trying to log in and move to a domain controller. And then we saw a suspicious login that was occurring from the domain controller. We then saw reasonable amount of enumeration, and bearing in mind from our perspective, we're seeing a login that's over RDP, we're seeing attacker run some commands, and that could be legitimate activity. We'll go through exactly what that looks like in a minute. And then we raise that as a high priority case at 8:14. Our SOC team were investigating this, and this was a massive learning point for us. But we didn't have pre-agreement with the customer at this individual point that we could isolate without their permission. And this was a point in the day when the customer was driving, we couldn't get hold of them, we couldn't reach in contact to them. We did have a contract which allowed us to isolate, but the customer's agreement and the process that we had with them was it was effectively, you must contact us before you isolate. And we had a very, very good working relationship with this customer. So we had issues contacting that customer, and we couldn't contact that customer. And by 9:03, when we were trying to contact that customer for around about 11 minutes, we were very, very confident that there was an attacker on the domain controller. We'd done an assessment that the domain controller, the attacker was effectively on the domain controller, and this customer was potentially moments away from having the entire DC compromised. And if the DC was compromised, yeah, then you're going to have a very, very bad day, and effectively you're going to have to rebuild potentially the entirety of your environment. So a learning point for us that we've taken now is we always have a pre-agreed decision tree with our customers in terms of here's a set of criteria based upon times of day, upon severity, and here's the situations when we can resolve things. And normally that would be like, try and contact us for a 15-minute period, and if it's this threat and it's on a server and it's this time of day, and if you assess that there wouldn't be an impact to business operations, then take the decision to isolate it. But yeah, very, very difficult point in time for our SOC in terms of we didn't have pre-agreed approval to isolate that, and it was very, very difficult to getting hold of the customer. So we resolved that, and that took us from the high priority event occurring, and we were still able to do that in under an hour. A little bit gutted, actually, that we couldn't do that quicker. We've got a few other situations when that we're not talking about today where we've been able to do that far quicker, but normally in about an hour. But interesting in this case, when you look at the timeline, an attacker came in, they did some scanning, they pulled the file back, they did that all within around about 30 minutes. But then they came back the next day at 7:12 in the morning, less than an hour later, or about an hour later, they'd logged into the domain controller. And then from that domain controller, with only an hour of activity the next day, they were then doing enumeration. They were kind of moving to a position to try and take down the entirety of this customer's network. So in terms of kind of what we saw, we had 11 distinct observations raised on the domain controller. I've given you an example of 3 of the different types of observations. If you've got overworked analysts and you're looking at this kind of stuff, hopefully your overworked analysts will be able to come to the same conclusion. So this is why managing that workload, making sure they're doing the right levels of investigations is important, because when you've got cases like PowerShell's made this connection to a Vietnamese domain, I've got someone running PowerShell exec bypass commands, which, that happens all the time. PowerShell exec bypass commands aren't necessarily malicious. That could be an administrator running a script. But then we see a temp PS1 file, an attacker, an overworked analyst, or an analyst who's not doing the right level of investigation could go, oh, could be a user just running a normal script because there's nothing in there in the temp PS1 file which suggested it was malicious. We then see PowerShell making a connection out externally, going out to a kind of a random French domain that we haven't before. And our analysts, luckily in this case, were able to see the alert, do a bit more analysis, go look in the raw PowerShell logs and make a determination of what on earth is going on here. So kind of key process takeaways is it's super useful on this one to kind of compare yourself to real world incidents. Generally, I'd say going back to that kind of CrowdStrike metric, if you probably want to be containing an incident in under an hour, I think that's very good based upon this one. We saw the attacker get on the network, move towards the DC in an hour, and then we were able to isolate that as soon as we saw it accessing the DC, which we were covering, and we were able to kind of do that in under, well, it was in an hour, but that was kind of key response timelines is you should be responding when you've got an alert in under an hour and being able to make a decision. That's on a 24/7 basis as well, because the attacker was able to come back into this environment as soon as that user's machine was on in the morning. And obviously your things like your DCs are on all the time, and the attacker was able to pivot onto those DCs. So being able to respond to an hour on a 24/7 basis is pretty critical. Key things for us, something we've learned from, is making sure we've got pre-agreed, we call them a decision tree. And that decision tree defines for the analyst who's making that decision that will probably be under stress at an awkward time of day with incomplete information of what decisions should they make for each individual customer. And that will normally be based upon as things like time of day, the systems, their confidence, the impact to the business, and we pre-agree those and we've defined those within our SOC, and they're adjusted and amended for each customer that we have. And I'd strongly recommend that you have a pre-agreed decision tree with your SOC, whoever's making those decisions at very awkward times of day. Also, just making sure your SOC and your team have the ability to do that analysis and going, oh, I've seen that PowerShell command, what was running it, how could I determine whether it's malicious or if I need to take action? Because often it's very difficult. You don't get a smoking gun. You don't get it saying this is obviously malicious. In this case, this was Gootkit, which had launched into an attacker's second stage, and they were doing manual attacks. So it was a hands-on keyboard attack. We believe it was a ransomware actor. And also in this environment, kind of having a look and taking an attacker's perspective of your estate. So things like Bloodhound, Sharphound, Ping Castle, running them periodically on your estate and figuring out what are the likely attack paths and how could you detect them and how could you kind of reduce the attack surface across your estate.
Next one is a healthcare customer. This is a very large customer. In the healthcare, we were deployed on about 10,000 endpoints. They did have a legacy antivirus that they were running. They also had SIEM. They had SenseOn. They had quite a large security team of about 10 security. Hopefully most people are aware of Cobalt Strike, but if you're not, Cobalt Strike is an adversary emulation tool. It costs money, but effectively there are cracked versions out there that people can use, and we see attackers using cracked versions all the time. It can be configured to be very, very stealthy, but often it allows an attacker to emulate different adversaries, so they can pretend to be a stealthy adversary, or they can pretend to be a very loud adversary. So we see it used by hands-on keyboard attackers all the time, as an alternative to things like Metasploit. So within this customer, they were using a legacy antivirus. So SenseOn was operating without the antivirus component on that. We were only detecting processes that were running and network connections, things like that. And this user had a USB drive, which they plugged into their system at 155. And then a couple of minutes later, we saw some unusual executables that were running from that location. So we saw that from 155, we saw those unusual executables running 11 minutes later. So they didn't execute them straight away. Now, as a note, those unusual executables were, so we weren't running the anti-malware component. What that means is we're not doing the traditional job of an antivirus. So we're not analyzing on disk every single file that's running. We were limited in only watching which processors were running, where they were executing, connections from them, things like that. Now, we then saw other weird activity on that, and effectively we saw some enumeration activity. And as I'll show you in a minute, we're tracking unusual parent-child processes. I'll show you this and what that means in a moment. And we saw that at about 2:17, and we saw the enumeration start just before that. So we had at 2:17, we had a high priority case raised on this individual customer. And on this customer, we then saw a couple of minutes later, around about 10, 12 minutes later, we saw beacon activity. So we saw connections coming from this customer going out towards the internet that we hadn't started. We also saw on that system something called persistence being created, and that means that the attacker, when they're on the system, is trying to do it. So whilst they started their execution on the removable media drive, if they could come back to that computer at any point and their malware would run even if the computer would restart it. We then saw some attempted lateral movement. So we'll show you this in a minute. They were trying to steal credentials on that system, attack other systems, like go get towards that domain controller as we saw before. Now, luckily, we'd learned from the previous incident that we needed to have pre-agreed decision trees, and we had a pre-agreed decision tree with this customer. So our SOC was able to isolate the system after doing this analysis, and I'll show you how complicated that analysis is in a moment, but we're able to isolate that at 2:55. So about 35 minutes or so after the incident occurred, we'd isolated this and we kind of prevented the infection. And the reason why this is important is because often when you've got an attacker who's pivoting laterally across an estate, you need to not only just isolate on one system, you need to know where that infection came from. So with the previous example, if you saw a connection that was on the domain controller and you saw weird activity, if you just isolated it on the DC and you didn't do that on the source device or didn't identify the original device where it was compromised, your isolation will be completely ineffective. And that's why you need to make sure you've got sufficient tools and analysis to really get back to what was the root cause, how did that occur in the place. Because we'd isolated it and we had pre-agreed decision tree, we then contacted the customer after we'd done the isolation because we wanted to get that isolation in immediately, because we'd identified at this point that this was likely Cobalt Strike and there was quite literally a hands-on keyboard attacker in another part of the world running this. So we then contacted the customer about 50 minutes later. Analysts need to write it up, make sure it's coherent, send it out to the customer through their agreed methods. And later on in the day, we were able to get a copy of that USB drive to analyze it. And I'll show you kind of what this looks like. And I stress, Defender for Endpoint didn't pick up this initial kind of infection. I shouldn't have said the vendor's name there. So initial execution, this is what the initial execution looked like. So we map parent and child processes. We also map all these network connections and what's going on in the system. So the parent name is the process that's running, and then it launches what's called child processes. So the process will run other things. So taking you from the top, Explorer, which is the graphical user interface in the Windows environment. Someone had run from the graphical user interface, run the Windows command line. So they probably clicked on a script which was running in the USB drive, and it kicked off this whole chain. Now, with there was some basic enumeration activity that was going on. So you might see them here going, why from the Windows command line were they pinging 127.0.0.1? We believed in this case they were trying to detect, is there a valid networking stack, or are they running in a sandbox? So if they don't get a ping back from 127.0.0.1, there's no networking stack, and that is a good indication that they're running in a sandbox. Very, very, very basic test. I'm aware of that. It's not an advanced test. But then you'll see later on, the Windows command line launches their second stage, e.exe. Then e.exe loads a DAP file, and then you'll see Reg Server 32 launching Windows Error Manager, Windows Error Reporting Manager. This is something called process hollowing and process injection. And in simple terms, effectively, process hollowing is it finds a running process and they put their own code in there so they can appear as if they're running as that. So all of the activity that you're seeing later on in this will then appear from Windows Error and Reporting Manager, which is why training your analysts on what attackers are going to do, what would a competent adversary do in your estate is really, really important, because as I'll show you in a minute, when you start to see Windows Error and Reporting Manager accessing all sorts of things, you might be thinking the Windows Error and Reporting Manager is trying to create a diagnostic or trying to understand what's going on in the system, but actually we were able to go back in time and figure out that there was process hollowing and process injection going on at that individual point. So here we can see Windows Error Reporting Manager running all sorts of enumeration. So it starts off with things like, who am I? So they're trying to figure out what often most users don't need to know who they are in a system because they know who they are. They're trying to understand what levels is the script running, what permissions have they got. We can then see things like they're trying to figure out what group they belong to across the domain, things like who are the domain admins, what are the domain controllers. Going through this later on, we then see Windows Error Manager continuing to launch things like the Windows command line, and you can see them running commands to try and find high-value devices across the network. So you can see them, they download and run their own tool. It's not their own tool, but it's an external tool called AD-Find, and this helps them map and understand what's going on in Active Directory groups and users. And they're basically trying to list out things like the operating systems and every single computer that's on the domain. They then run other commands, so things like what antivirus products are running, what anti-spyware products, what firewall products, and we've got a lot of detections which analyze this kind of enumeration activity, because even though some tools run this legitimately, it's very easy to baseline who's running similar commands and alert you when you start seeing kind of weird commands from this, which you don't normally kind of expect to see. We'd only seen 4 megabytes of telemetry coming from this because all of the activity was occurring through a text interface, so the attacker didn't have a GUI on the system, so they effectively have what's called a remote shell, so they can type things on the command line and get it to appear on that end system. So on this one, having kind of skilled analysts is the most important thing for me, because if your analyst can't understand basic tools and techniques like process hollowing and process injection, when you come to deal with a case like this, it's you could potentially think it's absolutely legitimate activity. So training them on real world scenarios and what they look like. Also kind of understanding and training your staff on things like USB devices. We still see a lot of customers get infected with malicious USB drives, particularly if they've got any kind of manufacturing site or any kind of production facilities going on. So that's very, very, very common. It's we see this all the time. We've also seen kind of environments where attackers have dropped things like USB devices in car parks, things like that. More often than not, they're red team activities versus malicious, but we do see the odd malicious one that isn't a red team activity absolutely occurring. And also, just basic controls, like we talk about things like USB controls. That is a common vector, but there are tools built into Windows to help you manage this. You don't need to necessarily go buy another tool to manage this. Just use tools that are built into Windows or built into, if you're using kind of Macs, in terms of whether you're using something like Jamf or Kanji to manage those controls. And I highly recommend whichever vendor you choose, running these scenarios against them, whether you're using SenseOn, whether you're using any kind of managed SOC, running red team activities periodically to test how effective they are is super useful. Like, I absolutely love it when customers run a genuinely good test against us, which pretends to be a real advanced actor doing this kind of stuff, because we're able to kind of show that we're really, really effective. I just stress, if you're going to run those tests, just make sure they are representative and of sufficient quality, and not just like someone visits a website and there's nothing else, but show like an attacker going through that kill chain from initial access, persistence, lateral movement, enumeration of the environment, command and control, potential exfil, all of those kind of key steps that you're going to see for the kind of things that we should be training and managing our SOC to stop. So in summary, absolutely critical to kind of measuring your performance and giving you kind of 3 basic metrics of mean time to acknowledge, mean time to investigate, and mean time to respond. That mean time to respond absolutely should be in an hour. That should be your target. From what we've seen, attackers will move across your estate in about an hour. So you need to be kind of responding in under that hour time period. And that's on a 24/7 basis, because after they've had that initial access and persistence, they will come back in as soon as they can. And they might come back the next day. And you also need to be able to look at real world scenarios and going, could I actually defend this? So in the first scenario, they got onto one system, they then pivoted onto the domain controller. If you haven't got the logs to determine what the real source of that was and then where that came from, like, you'd be isolating the DC and not realizing the true source of the infection. So they just hit another DC in the environment, and you'd be absolutely stuffed. Obviously, we should be looking at preventative controls. I'm talking a lot about detection and response, but where possible, try and reduce the risk of these things occurring in before, so you don't need to rely on detection and response. So things like USB controls, potentially things like app locker, things like maybe you should have some controls too. In the past, we focused on things like Microsoft Office and the controls there, but things like JavaScripts and how they execute on your endpoints. And also, please make sure your SOC or your external partner has a pre-agreed process of when they can make decisions without having to go through the rigmarole of contacting people potentially at very, very awkward times, because you'll force them to make a decision, and doing nothing is a decision. So if you decided that they have to escalate that and delay things intentionally, that you're going to be in kind of a bad spot. And that should be reflective of the different systems. So if you've got an end user device, most of our customers say, if it's an end user device, I don't care, you can isolate it without speaking to me. But if it's something like a DC, we need to have that conversation, or something which is going to impact production. So just factor that in when you're creating up your own DC. That's it from me. I've kind of given you, hopefully, kind of enough to kind of start looking at how you're doing, how you're assessing the effectiveness of the detection and response across your teams. I've got my email. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll leave it 30 seconds for questions, but thank you very, very much for your time. And I've really kind of, appreciate you being here. Thank you.